In 1980, William Koch was fired from his family's company by his own brother, Charles. It wasn't just business, it was a declaration of war. That first war would last 20 years, cost hundreds of millions, and tear apart America's wealthiest dynasty. But it was only the beginning. The second war, waged by brothers Charles and David, was for a much bigger prize. They were no longer fighting for a company. They were fighting for the soul of America itself. And whether you realize it or not, we are all living in the world they created. Our story begins with one man, Fred Koch, born in 1900 on the raw, unforgiving Texas frontier. A brilliant chemical engineer from MIT, his ambition was quickly met with the brutal reality of corporate power when major oil companies sued him out of the American market. Forced to work abroad, he took a fateful contract building oil refineries for Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union in the early 1930s. What he witnessed there was not progress, but a nightmare of state control, famine, and terror. He saw colleagues vanish into Stalin's purges and return to America a changed man, convinced that government was the ultimate threat to human freedom. This experience became his crusade. Armed with this fervent anti-communist ideology, he founded a small oil company in Kansas that would one day become Koch Industries. He also became a founding member of the John Birch Society, a far-right group that saw communist conspiracies everywhere. He raised his 4 sons in a home that was less a family and more an ideological training ground, drilling into them the virtues of rugged individualism and a deep-seated hatred for collectivism. He wasn't just building a company, he was forging a dynasty, an ideological empire built on oil and fear. But that empire would need its emperors. When Fred Koch died of a heart attack while duck hunting in November 1967, he left behind a solid, respectable, but by no means colossal oil and ranching company. More importantly, he left a complex and volatile legacy to his 4 sons, each a product of his demanding and ideologically rigid upbringing, yet each a distinctly different man. The stage was now set for the second act of the Koch saga, a story of how 2 brothers, armed with their father's philosophy but possessing a far grander vision, would take a modest family firm and transform it into one of the largest and most powerful private corporations on earth. But this transformation would come at a cost, sowing the seeds of a fraternal conflict that would ultimately tear the family apart. Let's meet the players. First, there was Frederick R. Koch, the eldest. Frederick was the outlier, the aesthete in a family of engineers and businessmen. While his father preached the virtues of rugged individualism and the evils of collectivism, Frederick was drawn to the world of art, literature, and historic preservation. He was more at home in a European salon than a Kansas boardroom. He loved his father, but he never truly shared his all-consuming passion for business or his hardline political ideology. For Frederick, the company was a source of income that allowed him to pursue his true passions, not the central mission of his life. This detachment would eventually place him on the sidelines of the coming power struggle, an ally to one brother, but a bystander in the grander scheme. Then there was Charles G. Koch, the second son, and the undisputed heir to his father's ideological throne. Charles was a brilliant, intense, and deeply intellectual man. Like his father, he studied at MIT, earning multiple degrees in engineering. But Charles wasn't just an engineer, he was a philosopher of business. He devoured the works of free market economists like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, thinkers who argued that markets were complex, organic information systems that could never be effectively replaced by central planning. For Charles, these weren't just economic theories. They were fundamental truths about human society. He saw the company not just as a vehicle for profit, but as a laboratory to prove the superiority of his free market principles. After a brief stint at a consulting firm, he returned to the family business in 1961 at his father's urging. Fred, fearing his son was being seduced by the Eastern establishment, told him, "You can work for me, or you can be a bum." Charles came home, and it was clear from the start that he possessed a unique and relentless drive. He was his father's son, but with an ambition that dwarfed even Fred's. And then there were the twins, David and William, known as Bill. Born in 1940, they shared a birthday, but had vastly different personalities. David, like Charles, was an MIT-trained chemical engineer. He was tall, charismatic, and sociable, the more public-facing of the two dominant brothers. He joined the company in 1970 and became the perfect partner for his more introverted and cerebral older brother. While Charles was the grand strategist, David was the master executive, expanding the company's reach, particularly in the chemical and technology sectors, and serving as its ambassador to the wider world. He was a bon vivant, a fixture on the New York social scene, a man who could charm clients and politicians with equal ease. His twin Bill was a different story. Bill was also an MIT graduate, earning 3 degrees, including a doctorate in chemical engineering. He was every bit as intelligent as his brothers, but he was also more volatile, more emotional, and deeply competitive. He felt he was constantly living in the shadow of his twin, David, and his powerful older brother, Charles. He joined the family business and ran a segment of its operations, but he felt his ideas were often dismissed and his contributions undervalued. He chafed under Charles's absolute control, believing the company should be run more democratically, with all 4 brothers having an equal say. This simmering resentment, this feeling of being the overlooked brother, would become the spark that would eventually ignite a full-blown family war. Upon Fred Koch's death, the initial plan was for the brothers to work together, but it was Charles who immediately and decisively took the reins as chairman and CEO in 1967. He was not interested in maintaining the status quo. He saw his father's company as a foundation upon which to build a global empire. To do this, he began to develop and implement a radical management philosophy he called market-based management, or MBM. This wasn't just a set of corporate guidelines, it was a comprehensive worldview, a direct application of Hayekian and Misesian economics to a corporate structure. It was Charles's grand synthesis of everything he believed. Charles didn't want to run a company, he wanted to build an ecosystem. He called it market-based management, and the idea was brutal, but brilliant. He had one vision: long-term value, no matter the short-term cost. He didn't hire for resumes, he hired for character, for what he called virtue and talents. He wanted a company of principled entrepreneurs, but his most radical idea was how knowledge worked. He shattered the corporate hierarchy. A junior engineer wasn't just allowed to challenge a senior manager, they were expected to. The best idea won, no matter who it came from. The people with the knowledge got the power to make decisions, not the people with the fancy titles. The result? Koch Industries stopped being a machine. It became a living organism, constantly adapting, evolving, and growing at a terrifying pace. It was a jungle, and it was designed to create the most efficient financial predators on Earth. This new approach fueled a period of explosive growth. They didn't just grow, they evolved. Charles and David began a strategic and relentless campaign of acquisition and diversification. They reinvested up to 90% of the company's earnings back into the business, a practice that allowed for compounding growth on a staggering scale. They bought the Pine Bend refinery in Minnesota in 1969, a facility that was then considered a second-tier asset. Applying MBM principles, they overhauled its operations, empowered its workers to innovate, and turned it into one of the most efficient and profitable refineries in North America. They pushed deeper into the energy infrastructure, acquiring thousands of miles of pipelines that formed the arteries of their growing empire. They vertically integrated, controlling the process from the wellhead to the gas pump. They expanded aggressively into chemicals, fertilizers, minerals, and ranching. The goal was to create a web of mutually reinforcing businesses, a diversified conglomerate that wasn't solely dependent on the volatile price of crude oil. By the late 1970s, Koch Industries was no longer just Fred Koch's company. It was a sprawling, multifaceted, and immensely profitable behemoth, and its value was skyrocketing. But as the empire grew, so did the fissures within the founding family. The very philosophy that was making them all fantastically wealthy was also the source of their deepest conflict. For Bill Koch, MBM was not a brilliant framework for human flourishing. It was a cult of personality centered on Charles. He saw his brother not as a philosopher king, but as an autocrat who used complex jargon to justify his total control. Bill had his own ideas about how to run the business. He was more of a swashbuckling dealmaker, eager to chase high-risk, high-reward ventures. He wanted Koch Industries to make big, headline-grabbing plays, to be more like the aggressive corporate raiders who were coming to define the 1980s. He saw Charles's MBM-driven approach, with its emphasis on steady, long-term, incremental value creation, as too slow, too cautious, too boring. The tension wasn't just philosophical, it was deeply personal. In the boardroom, Bill felt his proposals were systematically shot down, not on their merits, but because they didn't fit neatly into Charles's rigid MBM framework. He felt that Charles and David formed an unbreakable alliance, a two-man voting bloc that rendered his own position and that of his older brother Frederick effectively meaningless. He would present a deal, and Charles would counter with a dense MBM-laced argument for why it was a violation of their core principles. To Bill, it felt like a condescending lecture. To Charles, Bill was an impulsive subordinate who simply didn't or wouldn't understand the sophisticated system that was the source of their success. The arguments grew more frequent, more heated. The boardroom became a battleground. It was a clash of two powerful, brilliant, and utterly incompatible egos. Frederick, for his part, largely stayed out of the fray, but his sympathies lay with Bill. He disliked the corporate culture Charles was building, and felt like Bill that his own influence as a major shareholder was being marginalized. He saw Charles and David as workaholics who had sacrificed everything for the company, and he wanted no part of it. His siding with Bill, however passively, created a clear divide. It was Charles and David on one side, the builders of the empire, and Bill and Frederick on the other, the disaffected heirs. The breaking point came in the late 1970s. Bill became convinced that Charles was not just outmanaging him, but actively scheming to dilute his and Frederick's power and hoard the company's massive profits. He grew suspicious of the accounting, the transfer pricing between divisions, and the way Charles valued the company's stock. He decided he could no longer fight from within. He had to take control. So in secret, Bill began to plot a boardroom coup. It was a move of breathtaking audacity, an attempt to wrest control of the family dynasty from the man who saw himself as its rightful ruler. He quietly began to court other members of the board and key shareholders, making his case that Charles's leadership was too autocratic and his management style too insular. his plan was to assemble a majority coalition that would vote to remove Charles as CEO and install a new leadership team, presumably one led by himself. But Koch Industries, under Charles, was not a place where secrets lasted long. The knowledge-sharing principles of MBM, designed to foster open communication, also created a highly effective intelligence network. Word of Bill's maneuvering got back to Charles, and Charles's response was not emotional or explosive. It was swift, cold, and decisive. In 1980, before Bill could fully execute his plan, Charles confronted him. The showdown was brutal. Charles accused Bill of disloyalty, of trying to destroy the very company their father had built. Bill accused Charles of being a tyrant who treated his own brothers like disobedient employees. There was no reconciliation. For Charles, this was the ultimate betrayal, a violation of the trust and integrity that were supposedly core to his management philosophy. The result was immediate and uncompromising. Bill Koch was fired from Koch Industries. The firing of a brother, a twin brother no less, sent a shockwave through the family. The private disagreements had now spilled over into an open declaration of war. The situation was untenable, with Bill on the outside actively hostile and Frederick siding with him. The four brothers could no longer coexist as owners of the company. A divorce was necessary. Charles and David decided the only way to secure the future of the company and their control over it was to buy out their dissident brothers. What followed was a tense and acrimonious negotiation to put a price on 1/4 of one of the world's largest and most complex private companies. How do you value something that isn't publicly traded? How do you account for future growth, for the labyrinthine network of pipelines, refineries, and chemical plants? Charles and David hired investment banks, including Goldman Sachs, to conduct an appraisal. Bill and Frederick hired their own experts. The two sides were worlds apart. The core of the dispute was the company's future prospects. Bill argued that Charles and David were deliberately hiding the true potential of the company, using conservative projections to arrive at a lowball valuation. He believed the company was on the cusp of an unprecedented growth spurt and that his brothers were trying to cheat him out of his rightful share of that future. Charles and David countered that their valuation was fair, based on multiple independent assessments, and that Bill's projections were wildly optimistic and rooted in bitterness, not reality. Finally, in 1983, after months of bitter haggling, they reached a deal. Charles and David agreed to buy out Bill and Frederick's shares for a staggering sum, $1.1 billion. Frederick received roughly $620 million, and Bill, who owned a slightly smaller stake, received $470 million. In today's money, that's a multi-billion-dollar payout. For almost anyone else on the planet, this would have been the end of the story. A golden parachute of unimaginable size, a ticket to a life of luxury and peace. But for Bill Koch, it wasn't about the money. It was about the principle. It was about the fact that he believed he was still being cheated, that his brothers had won, not through superior strategy, but through deceit. He took the money, but he never accepted the peace. In 1983, a staggering $1.1 billion deal was struck to buy out Bill and Frederick. It was meant to be a clean break, an astronomically expensive end to the feud. But for Bill Koch, it was never about the money. It was about the principle. He felt cheated, disrespected, and marginalized. So while he took the payout, he never accepted the peace. That billion-dollar check wasn't a settlement. It was a war chest. And Bill was about to use that fuel to ignite a legal fire that would consume hundreds of millions of dollars, drag the secrets of America's most private family into the public spotlight and rage for the next 2 decades. Using his newfound capital, Bill founded his own energy company, Oxbow Corporation. It was a direct act of defiance, a venture designed to prove that he could beat Charles and David at their own game. And he was successful. Oxbow grew into a billion-dollar conglomerate in its own right, with interests in coal, natural gas, and steel. But business success did little to soothe his anger. The feeling of being cheated, of his brothers allegedly stealing his rightful inheritance by lowballing the value of Koch Industries, became an obsession. He hired a team of lawyers, forensic accountants, and private investigators to dig into every corner of his brother's business. He was looking for a smoking gun, any piece of evidence that would prove his suspicions of fraud. In 1985, 2 years after the buyout, Bill launched his opening salvo. He filed a massive lawsuit against Charles and David in federal court. The core allegation was simple and devastating: that his brothers had deliberately and systematically hidden the true value of Koch Industries during the 1983 negotiations, cheating the selling shareholders out of what Bill's team estimated was more than $2 billion. This wasn't just a business dispute. In Charles Koch's deeply ideological world, it was a profound betrayal. For a man whose entire philosophy was built on private contracts, voluntary exchange, and keeping the government out of business, having his own brother use the federal court system to attack him was the ultimate hypocrisy. It was, in his view, an act of war, and a war it became. This was not a single court case. It was a sprawling, multi-front legal conflict that would eventually encompass over 20 distinct lawsuits. It was a war of attrition, fought by armies of the most expensive lawyers money could buy. The legal discovery process was brutal. Bill's lawyers sought to pry open every confidential file, every internal memo, and every financial record of the notoriously secretive Koch Industries. They deposed executives, board members, and the brothers themselves for hours and days on end. The lawsuits exposed the family's dirty laundry in excruciating detail. Allegations flew back and forth. Bill accused Charles and David of running a secretive and conspiratorial organization. He claimed they used corporate funds as a personal piggy bank and engaged in questionable business practices, including, he alleged, taking oil from federal and Native American lands without proper payment, a claim that sparked a separate federal investigation. Charles and David fired back, painting Bill as a bitter, vindictive failure who was using the legal system for a shakedown. Their lawyers portrayed him as a disgruntled employee who had been fired for incompetence and was now trying to extort the brothers who had built the empire. They argued the 1983 valuation was more than fair, backed by reputable firms, and that Bill was simply suffering from a case of seller's remorse after the company's value continued to explode throughout the 1980s and 90s. The financial cost of this war was staggering. Together, the brothers spent an estimated hundreds of millions of dollars on legal fees alone. It was a full employment act for an entire generation of corporate lawyers. But the emotional cost was even greater. The family was irrevocably shattered. Communication ceased, replaced by legal notices and sworn testimony. The brothers who had grown up under the same roof were now sworn enemies, communicating only through their attorneys. It was a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, played out in the sterile environment of courtrooms and deposition rooms. Their mother, Mary Koch, was caught in the middle, heartbroken. She reportedly pleaded with her sons to reconcile, but the wounds were too deep, the animosity too entrenched. At one point, she was even forced to give a deposition in a lawsuit her own children had filed against each other. The public feud became a media sensation, chronicled in business journals and newspapers across the country. It created the first lasting public image of the Kochs, not as brilliant industrialists, but as a pathologically dysfunctional billionaire family at war. This narrative, amplified by books like Daniel Schulman's Sons of Wichita, painted Charles as a cold, ruthless, and controlling mastermind, and Bill as the wronged, rebellious brother fighting for justice. While this was a simplification of a complex dynamic, the image stuck. It cemented a perception of Charles and David as men who valued power and control above all else, even family. After years of legal maneuvering, the main fraud case finally went to trial in 1998. The trial lasted for months. Bill's team presented evidence they claimed showed Koch Industries was secretly aware of major new assets and profit centers, like an expanded pipeline in Canada, that were not properly disclosed during the buyout. Charles and David's defense was meticulous, arguing that all relevant information had been shared and that Bill's claims were based on hindsight. In the end, the jury sided with Charles and David, finding no evidence of fraud. It was a crushing legal defeat for Bill. While he did win some smaller legal skirmishes over the years, including a $25 million settlement, in a related case he lost the main event. The war for billions was over. Yet, in a strange way, the battle had transformed Bill Koch. It had given him a cause, a purpose outside the shadow of his brothers. While he lost in court, the fight itself seemed to forge a new identity for him. He became a prominent philanthropist and art collector. Most famously, he became a celebrated yachtsman. In 1992, he spent over $65 million of his own money to win the America's Cup, the world's most prestigious sailing trophy. It was a victory on his own terms, a public triumph that had nothing to do with Koch Industries. It was as if he needed to prove to the world and to himself that he could win something spectacular without his family's name. The war finally ended around the year 2001, nearly 20 years after it began. The brothers reached a final confidential settlement, agreeing to drop all remaining litigation. There was no public reconciliation, no emotional reunion. There was only the quiet cessation of hostilities. The legal battles were over, but the damage was permanent. The conflict had solidified Charles and David's absolute control over their empire, purging all internal dissent. They were now free to run Koch Industries precisely as they saw fit, guided solely by the principles of market-based management. But it came at the cost of their family. The saga reinforced their public image as uncompromising leaders, willing to sacrifice anything, including the bond of brotherhood, for the sake of their business and their vision. The private war was over. Charles and David had won, solidifying absolute control over their empire and purging all internal dissent. Now, as the undisputed masters of this colossal industrial machine, they were free to turn their full, formidable attention outward. For them, business had never been just about money. It was about proving a philosophy. And so they took the immense profits from their company and the ideology their father had preached to begin a new war, not for control of the family, but for the soul of America itself. The foundation of this new war was the same ideology Fred Koch had forged in the crucible of Stalin's Russia. A deep, profound skepticism of government power and a fervent belief in the virtue of free markets. But Charles had refined his father's raw anti-communism into a more complex and intellectually rigorous libertarianism. He believed that the vast majority of government functions, from healthcare and education to environmental regulation and social safety nets, were an unjust infringement on individual liberty and a drag on economic prosperity. Society, he argued, would be freer, wealthier, and more innovative if the state simply got out of the way. Charles had already dipped his toe into direct politics once before, and the experience had taught him a valuable lesson. In 1980, he ran for vice president of the United States on the Libertarian Party ticket. The campaign was a spectacular failure, earning just over 1% of the popular vote. The lesson was clear. Trying to build a third party from scratch was a fool's errand. It was far more effective to influence and ultimately capture one of the two major parties from within. He would no longer try to win elections himself. He would build a machine to elect politicians who shared his worldview. This machine, which critics would later dub the Kochtopus for its sprawling, interconnected tentacles, was not built overnight. It was a patient, decades-long project, a systematic effort to reshape American society from the ground up. The strategy was brilliant in its comprehensiveness, attacking on three distinct fronts simultaneously: ideas, policy, and politics. First came the battle of ideas. Charles understood that politics is downstream from culture and ideas. To change policy, you first had to change the way people think. Starting in the 1970s, the Kochs began pouring millions into universities, endowing professorships and funding academic centers dedicated to the study of free market economics. Institutions like the Mercatus Center and the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University became hubs for developing the intellectual ammunition for their cause. The goal was to cultivate a new generation of scholars, economists, judges, and lawyers who viewed the world through a libertarian lens, creating a long-term systemic shift in the intellectual landscape. Parallel to this academic project, they funded a network of think tanks. They were instrumental in the creation of the Cato Institute in 1977, which would become one of the nation's most prominent libertarian think tanks. They also became major donors to established conservative institutions like the Heritage Foundation. The role of these organizations was to take the abstract ideas developed in academia and translate them into concrete, ready-to-use policy proposals, op-eds, and legislative blueprints that could be handed to friendly politicians. The second front was policy. Armed with intellectual legitimacy from their academic allies and specific proposals from their think tanks, the Koch network built a formidable lobbying presence in Washington, D.C., and in state capitals across the country. They spent lavishly to influence legislation pushing for deregulation, tax cuts, and policies favorable to their business interests. But this was far more than traditional checkbook lobbying. This led to the third and most visible front, politics. In 2004, the Kochs founded their signature political organization, Americans for Prosperity, AFP. AFP was the boots on the ground, the grassroots army that would bring the Kochs an ideological war to every corner of the country. It was structured not as a top-down Washington group, but as a nationwide federation with chapters in dozens of states. AFP would air millions of dollars in political ads, but its real power was in its ability to mobilize activists. They organized rallies, held town halls, went door to door, and put immense pressure on elected officials, from local school board members to United States senators. They could create the appearance of a spontaneous, organic uprising on almost any issue they chose. The full power of this integrated machine was unleashed in the late 2000s. In 2009, in the wake of the financial crisis and the election of Barack Obama, a new populist anger on the right began to bubble up: the Tea Party movement. The Koch network did not create the Tea Party, but they saw its potential and quickly moved to co-opt and professionalize it. They provided the funding, the organizational structure, and the media support that transformed a series of scattered protests into a disciplined political force. AFP organized rallies, bussed in supporters, and provided talking points, effectively harnessing the raw anger of the movement and directing it toward the Koch's long-standing policy goals, fighting government spending, opposing healthcare reform, and demanding deregulation. The result was a political earthquake. In the 2010 midterm elections, the Tea Party wave swept dozens of hardline conservatives into office, giving Republicans control of the House of Representatives and fundamentally shifting the center of gravity of the party to the right. With their allies in place, the Koch network waged war on the Obama administration's signature policies. Their number one target was the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. To them, the ACA was the ultimate symbol of government overreach. From 2009 to 2016, the network spent hundreds of millions of dollars in a relentless campaign to undermine and repeal the law, a political war that directly threatened the healthcare security of millions of American families. AFP ran ads portraying the law as a government takeover of healthcare, organized protests, and educated citizens on its supposed evils. They held their allied politicians' feet to the fire, demanding they vote for repeal again and again. At the same time, the network was engaged in another even more controversial campaign, the fight against climate change regulation. This was a battle where the Koch's ideological convictions and their business interests aligned perfectly. Koch Industries, with its vast network of refineries, pipelines, and chemical plants, is one of the largest industrial emitters of carbon dioxide in the United States. Any serious regulation aimed at curbing greenhouse gases, like a carbon tax or cap-and-trade system, would represent a direct threat to their bottom line. For decades, the Koch network funded a network of think tanks, advocacy groups, and scientists who worked to sow doubt about the severity of climate change, a campaign whose consequences now shape the very world we live in, from record-breaking heat waves to the intensity of the storms that batter our coasts. Organizations like the Cato Institute and the Competitive Enterprise Institute publish studies questioning climate models and emphasizing the costs of regulation. They ran sophisticated PR campaigns to frame environmentalists as alarmists who wanted to destroy the economy. They lobbied relentlessly in Washington to kill any legislation that would put a price on carbon. Their opposition was a key factor in the defeat of the Waxman-Markey cap-and-trade bill in 2009, and in President Trump's later decision to withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement on climate. By the early 2000s, the Koch political machine had reached the zenith of its power. Through their semi-annual secret donor summits, Charles and David were coordinating a network of hundreds of wealthy conservatives, directing hundreds of millions of dollars per election cycle into their preferred causes and candidates. They had built a private political and ideological infrastructure that rivaled and in some ways surpassed the official Republican Party itself. They had successfully merged their corporate empire with a political crusade, creating a force that could not only influence elections, but could shape the very laws and ideas that govern the nation. The sons of the anti-communist crusader from Kansas had become the architects of their own political revolution. But their very success bred a powerful backlash. As their influence reshaped the Republican Party, halted environmental legislation, and waged war on the Affordable Care Act, journalists and watchdog groups began to ask one critical question: where was all this money coming from? The answer would ignite one of the most explosive political debates of the modern era and forever attach the Koch name to the controversial concept of dark money. The secret to the network's financial power lay in its clever use of the American tax code. While they operated super PACs that had to disclose their donors, the heart of their operation was a collection of nonprofit organizations, most notably their flagship group, Americans for Prosperity. These groups are classified as 501c for social welfare organizations. Under the law, they are allowed to engage in political advocacy and issue education, but unlike official political campaigns, they are not required to publicly disclose the names of their donors. This was the engine of the Koch machine. Through their exclusive semi-annual donor summits, Charles and David would gather hundreds of the wealthiest conservatives in the country. These donors could then write enormous 7- or 8-figure checks to the network's nonprofits, their identities completely shielded from public view. This vast pool of untraceable money, dark money, was then used to fund the ads, rallies, and grassroots campaigns that shaped elections across the country. To their critics, this was a perversion of democracy. They argued that the Kochs had created a shadow party, a political machine accountable to no one but its wealthy, anonymous benefactors. It allowed billionaires and corporations to secretly flood the political system with cash, drowning out the voices of ordinary citizens and bending the political process to serve their own financial and ideological interests. This critique was most powerfully articulated in Jane Mayer's groundbreaking 2016 book, Dark Money: The Hidden History of the Billionaires. Behind the rise of the radical right, which placed the Koch brothers at the center of this secretive network, the Kochs and their allies fiercely defended their methods, arguing that donor privacy was essential to protect individuals from political harassment and was a form of free speech. But the dark money label stuck, forever linking their political project with secrecy and the subversion of transparency. The network's influence reached its peak during the Obama years and into the Trump administration. In the 2012 election cycle, the network pledged to spend $400 million to defeat Barack Obama, a sum that rivaled the spending of the official Republican Party. And while they failed in that goal, their efforts succeeded in pulling the entire political debate to the right. Their greatest legislative victory came in 2017 with the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. The law, a centerpiece of the Trump administration's agenda, dramatically slashed the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. It was the culmination of decades of advocacy by the Koch network. For them, it was a triumph of free market principles. For their critics, it was the ultimate proof of their business-driven agenda. The network had spent billions of dollars on politics, and in return, their flagship company, Koch Industries, stood to save billions in taxes. Yet, as their political influence became a subject of national debate, a more complex picture of the brothers began to emerge, particularly of David Koch. While he was the co-architect of this hard-nosed political machine, he was simultaneously one of the nation's most prolific philanthropists. After surviving a battle with prostate cancer, he donated hundreds of millions of dollars to cancer research and hospitals, including massive gifts to MIT and New York Presbyterian Hospital. He was also a passionate patron of the arts, giving over $100 million to renovate Lincoln Center's New York State Theater, now the David H. Koch Theater, and donating generously to the American Museum of Natural History. This created a jarring contradiction. How could a man who gave so much to save lives and enrich culture also be the public face of a political network that fought tirelessly against environmental regulations designed to protect public health and combat climate change? This paradox is central to his legacy, a man who used one part of his fortune to fund hospitals and another to fight the very government agencies tasked with keeping the air and water clean. It was a contradiction that his critics called hypocrisy, but that his supporters saw as a consistent application of his libertarian philosophy. Problems, he believed, should be solved by private philanthropy and innovation, not by coercive government bureaucracy. The formidable partnership that had defined the Koch empire for nearly half a century came to a quiet end in the summer of 2018. Citing declining health, David Koch stepped down from his roles at both Koch Industries and Americans for Prosperity. A little over a year later, on August 23, 2019, David died at the age of 79. His death marked the end of an era. The Koch brothers were no more. With Charles alone at the helm, now in his 80s, the network began a surprising and subtle evolution. It softened its partisan edges and pivoted toward issues where it could find bipartisan agreement. The most notable example was criminal justice reform. Believing the carceral state was another form of government overreach, the Koch network found itself making common cause with unlikely allies, including the ACLU, the Center for American Progress, and even organizations funded by liberal billionaire George Soros. They jointly pushed for legislation like the First Step Act, which was signed into law by President Trump in 2018 and led to the release of thousands of federal prisoners. This new direction was met with a mix of praise and deep skepticism. Was it a genuine change of heart from an aging Charles Koch, now focused on building bridges? Or was it simply a pragmatic rebranding, a strategic move to find new levers of influence in a deeply polarized nation? Make no mistake, the story of the Kochs is not over. Their imprint isn't a closed chapter in a history book. It's in the headlines of our daily news. David Koch is gone, but Charles Koch and the empire they built remain. The political machine they spent billions to create is still running, still lobbying, still shaping laws, and still fueling cultural wars. They succeeded in launching a revolution. And the true mark they've left is the fact that, whether you realize it or not, we are all living in the world that revolution created. Their war for the soul of America continues, and the battlefield is our future.